Hey there, welcome back to Pepper Geek. In today's video, we'll be going through our process for creating the perfect pepper garden.
Yeah, so we have multiple raised beds in our yard, as well as a 50 by 50 garden plot that we rent from the town, and we also keep a lot of pepper varieties in pots. So we're gonna go over kind of our thought process with our planning and how we decide what pepper goes where.
So when it comes to planning, what do we use to plan out where everything's gonna go? Well, we keep it pretty simple. We usually use pen and paper. Sometimes we use Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets, and we really don't go beyond that.
There's definitely a lot of gardening apps out there, but we've never used a garden planning app before. We find that keeping it simple works best and something that you can easily edit and change as you go.
Google Sheets is nice because we'll start the planning process in the winter when it's cold on our computers, and then when we get outside in the spring, we can access it on our phones. We also created these simple raised bed templates. We'll leave a link down below where you can get these for free. You can print them out. It's sort of nice to have something physical where you can write down what's gonna go where on top of a simple square foot grid like you see here.
And we even have a free peppers only raised bed planner if you want to print that out as well. We'll leave a link down to that below. So next we want to talk about where you're going to set up camp. Of course, you want to garden in a place that has adequate sunlight, drainage, and a good water source to make it easy to water your plants.
So each situation is different. Like Crystalline said, we have raised beds right next to our house, so we just use our hose to irrigate there. But we also have a 50 by 50 plot, and it's a lot harder to water there if it doesn't rain enough. So down there we use a rain barrel to collect rainwater in order to have enough water on hand.
So depending on your unique situation, deciding where you're going to actually set up your pepper plants is going to be a little bit different for everybody. Next, let's talk about where the pepper plants are actually going. So we have all of these options. We have pots, we have our raised beds, and we have the plot. How do we decide what varieties are going where?
So down at the garden plot, we have to be very organized in order to not get overwhelmed. So we tend to group things by sweet peppers and hot peppers, and we keep all of our peppers together. We grow other crops as well, believe it or not, so we do sort of section things off. So we have our pepper section and our tomatoes, garlic, leafy greens, etc., all in their individual spaces.
However, that's not the only way to do things. We actually do it a little bit differently at home in our raised beds. It's a good thing to intercrop and actually have a lot of different things next to each other to increase the crop diversity in the garden. For example, we have a little salsa garden going in the corner of one of our raised beds, and that's gonna have cilantro, basil, peppers, tomatoes, and onion.
And the reason we don't do that down at the garden plot is it's just a little bit too big for us to manage all of the different crops and know that in this 2 square foot area we have green onions and just next to it we have a couple of peppers. We prefer to just keep it simple down there because we're not over there as much. It's a little more neglected, and therefore we put a little more energy at our home garden.
Speaking of home, there are some varieties that we prefer to keep closer to home because we are home more frequently than we are at the garden plot. So if there's a variety that we want to do really well and it needs special care, then we make sure to plant that at home as opposed to the plot.
A good example is the hatch chilies that we grew last year. We're growing them again, but we'll have them in the home garden so that we can just run out, grab a couple, and bring them right inside.
Now, we also grow a lot of pepper varieties in pots, and we're still kind of deciding where our potted plants are going to go this year. So if you have any smaller varieties or ornamental varieties, they do really well in pots. We're growing 2 new varieties this year, the Sedona Sun and the Medusa Pepper. We're going to keep those in pots at home. Also, if you have any varieties that you need to move around the yard for whatever reason, planting them in a pot is very useful. We had our ricotos in pots last year because they don't like direct sunlight all the time, so we were able to keep it a little bit happier by keeping it in a pot and moving it around.
Speaking of smaller varieties, it's pretty important to consider where you're going to be positioning your peppers in the garden. Some of them can grow pretty tall, but there are other crops you might be growing that are even taller. So when you're positioning your peppers, you want to think about spacing, and most peppers do best about 2 feet apart from one another, stem to stem. But you can go a little bit tighter if you're working with limited space, but we recommend spacing wider just so that it's easier to access your plants, they have plenty of room to breathe, and you'll have an easier time harvesting.
And just as important is to make sure that you have enough room to walk through and actually harvest your peppers. If you have a huge 10 by 10 square of just peppers, you're not going to be able to access the ones in the middle, so make sure that you leave walkways and enough room to get through.
And a great option for walkways is to just throw down some cardboard so that the weeds don't come up and you don't have to waste money on expensive mulches or anything like that.
We've also used straw in the past and it works okay, so you don't need anything fancy. So this year we're growing a really diverse garden, and if you're only growing peppers, you may want to consider growing some other things as well. There are so many benefits to companion planting, and we're going to do the best we can to attract as many beneficial insects as we can to the garden.
So not only other crops like tomatoes and garlic and onions, but flowers are some of the best companion plants for your veggie garden. Some really easy to grow examples are sweet alyssum. They only grow about 6 or 8 inches tall, and they attract a wide variety of beneficial insects to your garden. And then you've got zinnias and cosmos and other warm weather blooming crops that are really easy to grow. You basically just throw the seeds into the soil once it's warm enough, and they come up and start to bloom.
And we do have a more in-depth video about companion planting if you want to check that out. And I think it's worth mentioning crop rotation as well. If you have several raised beds or a really large garden area that you're planting in for consecutive years, you can rotate your crops every season to help prevent disease and pests. Though this isn't hugely important in a smaller garden setting.
And lastly, and this is more optional and something that we encourage people to do, is if you want to run any experiments with your plants, you sort of have to plan that out ahead. So for example, these are our Jimmy Nardello plants. We're going to be doing a topping experiment with these. So we have 6 plants, 3 of them will be pruned early on, and 3 of them will be left to grow naturally. And so I've already labeled this with topping experiment, and this will be set aside. They'll have their own designated grow area and everything else.
We also have a grow light versus windowsill experiment happening, so it's really important to plan those things ahead of time so that you can keep track of the progress. We definitely have a lot of things that we're still working out, even though it is mid-April, and we always have some regrets. There's always something to figure out as we go.
Yeah, and we usually talk about it on the channel. We make mistakes every year, and we try to learn from them and move forward.
So let us know in the comments what your garden plans are, if you have any tips and tricks for creating the perfect pepper garden, or anything that you've done over the years that has definitely worked for you really well.
Thanks for watching Pepper Geek, and we'll see you next time.
We've never used a garden planning app before.
Google Sheets is really nice because they have an app.